Thank you so much for joining us today for this Natural History Live webinar, Dolphin and Porpoise Acoustic Monitoring, Discovering Trends in Cetacean Populations. It's brilliant to have you all here, and we can't wait to hear from Nick and Joe about the work they've been doing and the Cetacean Acoustic Track Trending Project. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Nick Tregenza from Chelonia. So over to Nick, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, is that coming across all right?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, so yes, you've heard the topic already. Those are some common dolphins. I got into this because my dad used to see large groups of small cetaceans here. This is Mousel in Cornwall, but they'd gone by 1970. And porpoises had also disappeared from the rivers and estuaries of England. And we've practically forgotten they were there. And river fish, we were just discovering, were loaded with organochlorines. And with others, I did a survey of the memories of 1,000 people and what they'd seen from the coast. And we put together this picture, which goes from 1945 to 85. And you can see that big drop in the height of the blue bars there. So there's no discrimination of species here, but the interesting thing was that this decline, which you can see goes from the sort of particularly the mid-50s to 70s, coincided with this discovery that organochlorines were having a huge impact. And Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring, which documented that and was a sort of revolutionary book in the history of nature conservation. So in 1989, I set up a dolphin group, and we sent observers out on the offshore netters in Cornwall. They were all volunteers. They did 300 days at sea. That's Kath McGuire, who did multiple trips. Actually, I'll just go back to that. But we discovered that 2,000 plus porpoises were getting caught every year as bycatch in the Celtic Sea, which was a shock to all of us. And it was quite a significant fraction of the population every year. So at this point, we kind of knew that both pollution and bycatch were serious problems. We didn't know anything about disease locally, but we were hearing that in the Mediterranean, striped dolphins were affected by a morbillivirus. That's a measles type of virus. And that killed like 95% of the striped dolphin populations. So that's a big factor. You know, we've all recently heard about the highly pathogenic avian flu, which has devastated some bird populations here. And then on top of this, there's disturbance, which is much studied and well recognized as having negative effects on just cetaceans, and habitat degradation, you know, whether it's trawling affecting the seabed or overfishing. And I haven't even mentioned climate change yet. So the point I'm trying to make here is that cetacean populations are not a kind of static thing. There's a lot going on, and we need to be able to monitor it. So the sort of conventional monitoring method is with line transect. So that's the Black Sea, which I'm going to mention quite a bit. And the black zigzag lines are the tracks of the vessels in a line transect survey of the Black Sea. So that's a very costly kind of survey to do. But it does give you very nice data. And these are the porpoise sightings along those track lines. And we get a big survey about every 10 years, the SCAN surveys on the seas of sort of Western Europe. But these are very expensive and a long way apart. So we set about, actually in response to the bycatch, getting an instrument made that could listen to the animals and recognize their presence from the sounds they make, initially focusing on porpoises. We've got an underground acoustic test tank, which is just next door to me here. It's Mousehole's answer to the Large Hadron Collider, and we're very proud of it. So it's a water-filled, the sort of star shape is filled with water, and we test instruments in there. So these instruments have become very useful. Initially, we were thinking they would be to try to understand bycatch, but here they are on the west coast of India monitoring finless porpoises and humpback dolphins, and they also have bottlenose dolphins along that coast. And that's a C pod and an F pod there. Here they are, earlier versions actually in Svalbard, in the Arctic, assessing whether belugas can be monitored acoustically. That was a very interesting study. And here's one being deployed by a fisherman on a gill netter. This is some very nice work done by the Cornwall Wildlife Trust on acoustic assessment of the effect of pingers. This is the kind of data these instruments collect. So in the bottom panel, each blue vertical line is one click made by a porpoise in this case, and the height of the line is how loud it is. And the spacing obviously tells you how frequently they're occurring, and that's what the red line above shows you. So that's actually a feeding buzz, where the porpoise is kind of looking around. The porpoise's sonar is a very narrow beam. It's like shining a little torch around the world and getting the echoes from where that beam of sound hits. So it's going along about 50 clicks a second, and then it jumps up to about 300. And in the lower panel, that nice smooth undulation at the beginning is actually showing us the tail beat rate of the porpoise, because its sound beam is so narrow that when its tail beats, it makes the head of the animal move up and down. So the sound beam kind of comes off the hydrophone and back onto it. So we can learn a lot from this kind of data. And here's some porpoise social calls from the Black Sea. And we're just discovering that porpoises are more social, and sometimes intensely social, than we'd known before. And their dolphins whistle, but porpoises don't. And porpoises communicate socially via these very fast click rates. So that's those mushrooms, as we call them now, are clicking at 600 clicks a second. So we had the instrument which was kind of aimed at bycatch, but then in Sweden they decided to really try and nail the question of whether the Baltic Sea harbour porpoise still exists, which was very contentious in management terms. And they set up this project called Samba, Static Acoustic Monitoring of Baltic Harbour Porpoises. And they put instruments across the Baltic. So this is in Finland, where you can drive out to your deployment site in winter, cut a hole through the ice. And in this case, the vertical instrument there is an acoustic release. And underneath it's got a bag of sand, which will hold it down. And then there's a pod. And you come back in a boat later in the year, send down an acoustic barcode, and your pod comes floating up to the surface with the acoustic release. So they were able, from their 300 sites, to put together a picture of what was happening. And I'm just going to kind of run through it. This is January, and the porpoises are all down in the southwest there, with just a few along the coast of Sweden. And February, they're moving in a little bit, but not very far. April, May. So May and June. Oh, they've got a mind of their own, these slides. So August, the very intense activity in the centre of the Black Sea. Again in October, November, December, and it's sort of quietening down again. So that map shows you where the instruments were deployed, the red dots. It's by far the biggest pod project. It's actually the biggest dedicated acoustic project on any animal ever, if you measure it in terms of the amount of data. So they were deploying instruments between 5 and 80 meters for 2 years, except for the period of ice cover. And 0.5 terabyte of data was brought ashore. But 12,000 terabytes were processed by the instruments. So this is one of the problems with acoustics, is you get huge volumes of data. But here the instruments have cut that down by a factor of 24,000. And we've still got the stuff we need. So this project was enormously useful because it gave that very strong picture showing that the animal is still there. It still migrates in the way it used to. And a very large marine conservation zone's been declared south of the island in the centre of the picture, which is Scotland, plus a couple of small ones along the coast of Sweden. So it completely settled the argument about whether the species still existed, and there had been two previous line transect surveys, quite expensive, not as expensive as this, but they only saw 2 porpoises, so they really couldn't answer any questions with it, except where did you see your 2 porpoises? Okay, so that was Samba. Actually, at the same time, there was a project that was trying to determine trends. This was on the Vaquita, an endemic porpoise species in the upper Gulf of California. So the Baltic, where Samba was done, was quite acoustically quite a nice environment to work in, but the animals were very spread out. Here, it was acoustically a very difficult environment. It had everything that we kind of hate in acoustic data. It had boat sonars, it had dolphins, which behaved like porpoises sometimes. It had snapping shrimps, it had moving sand. But nevertheless, the Mexicans who ran this were able to get good data. You can see there the boats that are the cause of the problem and the gill nets that are affecting this species. And here are some of the Mexican guys who were deploying the pods. And the guy in the foreground is an absolute genius at navigating a boat around pods which had no surface marker, but just had a line on the seabed, and hooking it up and pulling up the pod. They attracted from time to time the interest of the local pelicans, who would kind of overfly their operations, no doubt hoping for fish to appear. So they were able to construct a trend, and it's the last few 6 points or 5 on that graph of trends. And it was still reporting trends down to 30 individuals, and now they're down to about 10 individuals. I mean, it's a tragic situation from a conservation point of view. But basically, acoustically, they were able to do things that could never be done before. And the next project is a Trends project, and it's in the Black Sea, and that's their logo, Black Sea Trends. And this has been put together with the wonderful help of teleconferencing, Zoom programs, Zoom meetings. Here's, so that's Yulia Ivanchikova, is one of the driving forces behind the project, deploying a pod in off Odessa before the Russian aggression began. You can see a pod there that's just come up after cleaning and servicing and new batteries. It's put back down, but then the war started and they couldn't go to sea to recover it. But the next recovery of that very pod was actually by a demining team who were monitoring the coast for mines. And this guy, who was the commander of that unit, did not blow it up, which would be the normal response to anything that looked remotely like that, but identified its owners and returned it to them. So thanks to him. And here's the sites of their work in the Black Sea. So you've got Ukraine up at the top there, Georgia right over on the right in the east, then along coastline of Turkey with pods at Sinop and Zonguldak and Istanbul, and then Bulgaria and Romania. This has turned in a lot of data. So one of the interesting things is, you know, you're trying to measure trends, and we haven't even tried to estimate the trends yet, but a lot of other interesting stuff gets discovered. But one of the big problems we've got is that we can't, at the moment, distinguish the dolphin species. So they've got the bottlenose dolphin on the left there and the common dolphin at the top. We're hoping we will be able to do this, and we'll be able to do it retrospectively. But we can split off the harbour porpoise, which is bottom right, from all the dolphins. And on these kind of incidental things, they can see very clearly now that in the winter, the dolphins are right down in the south and east, so in Georgia and Turkey. And in the summer, they're up on the shelf by Ukraine. So this was extraordinarily valuable additional data, and it's just being worked up by Yulia Ivanchikova, who's a refugee now, but continuing her PhD at St Andrews University in Scotland. Okay, so the focus here is monitoring a trend. Trends are generally what you want to know. You know, is the animal doing better or worse? Are the numbers going up or down? And they can be easier to measure than the size of the whole population. Because instead of having to do all those line transects to cover that whole area, the idea is you sample the trend, a smaller set of sites. And if all those trends match, you can sort of safely infer that they represent what's happening to the whole population. If they don't match, it's going to be more difficult, but that's what statistics is here to help us with. And trends, you know, this needs to go on for years. That's the really key thing to getting a lot of value out of this. So the sites need to be easy to service. That means, you know, going out, putting the instruments down, getting them back, and not getting them lost or towed away or stolen. And the sites need to stay the same over multiple years. Doesn't mean you can't lose one or two sites and replace them, or decide early on that a site is too difficult or whatever. But basically, you're going to need stable, easy to monitor sites. And there will be interesting incidental findings. So here's one that was rather astonishing. It's from quite near here, and it's probably from common dolphins. So I'm challenging you to think about what's going on here. These are three groups of fast click trains from one or more common dolphins, and then 1.5 minutes. So the vertical lines, as before, are clicks, but actually at this scale, they all kind of run into one another. The color tells you the frequency. So the first group, quite low frequency. The second group of click bursts are higher in frequency. Then there's a long gap. And then there's a third group, which is rather different again. So, one thing we know from how directional the sound beam is that this animal is looking at the pod, as it were, with its sound beam. And it can't be swimming very fast, or it would have swum right over the top of the pod and disappeared from hearing, as it were. And it's probably only one animal, because there's like one pattern of repetition there, unless there's two of them duetting. So if we look into the click rate in these click bursts, we see something quite remarkable. That's the first group, then the second, then the third. So if we look at the first group there, bottom left, it's kind of got two click rate profiles in it. One of them rises from 50 up to sort of 70, stays there for a bit, and then sweeps up again. And the other one rises more steeply. So these are quite low click rates. They're in the normal kind of foraging range for dolphins, although the higher ones we'd think of as either being feeding buzzes or social calls. Anyway, so that's what the animal did in the first set of bursts. So there were 12 bursts there. In the second set, it's like massively different. The animal is starting off clicking around 700-800 clicks a second, and it's slowing down rather steadily. And then there's that long, and then there's a third group, which again, totally different. So if you've got a thought on what the animal is doing, you could put it in the chat now. I kind of looked at this and I asked a seal researcher, friend of mine, Stephen Westcott, to have a look, and he had a look and he said, well, it's clear, isn't it? They're trying to teach the pod to talk. and I think you can view being repeated, and the pod is failing dismally to respond. So the dolphin probably left with a very low opinion of pods. So anyway, to summarize, we major threats to cetaceans exist, so monitoring is needed. Acoustics is powerful, but distinguishing dolphin species is the biggest limitation. Deployment of pods is the main cost. And this approach of sampling the trend rather than trying to cover the whole population area reduces this. Finding good sites is key, and the good people or projects who can do the deployments. So anyway, we're sort of aware of all that, and then along comes the Black Sea people, and we think, we're not doing anything in Cornwall or England. Well, there is some work being done in Scotland. So we now have a project called CATT, Cetacean Acoustic Trend Tracking, which aims to get this kind of network of F-pods like they have in the Black Sea set up here. So I'm going to hand over to Joe, if I've got the slides right. Yeah, and he's going to talk about the CATT project. So Joe,
Thank you, Nick. Yes, so CATT was a project proposed by Nick and Chelonia a couple of years ago, and we looked into it and decided that what we needed was along the lines of the Black Sea and other projects. We needed fixed point monitoring for long-term monitoring, and that was the challenge. How do we get FPODs in the water and service them regularly? That would be about every 4 months, and do that for a period of 3 to 5 years. We were blessed in Cornwall in that we have the Wildlife Trust here, and they have an extensive group of marine conservation organisations who are all affiliated and all talk to each other regularly, and they have lots of students, lots of active people, and the take-up was very quick. As soon as we went to them and said, Chelonia is proposing that we will give you an FPOD, and you will put that in the water and gather data from it. Are you interested? And they all said yes. That the challenge came when we wanted to get them in the water for a long period, a fixed point for 3 to 5 years. And we got around that with many of these groups by collaborating with the local boatmen, the safari boat operators. The port authorities were very useful too, but particularly the universities. And that is largely to do with the flexibility of the instrument. We found that with FPODs, we were also picking up fish tags, we were picking up the water temperature, we were picking up sediment transportation, and the universities found a lot of interest in what we were doing and agreed to share a lot of their acoustic release sites with us. So in that first year, we were looking at possibly getting 2 or 3 pods in and seeing how it went. We had 15 or 16 as shown on this map, and they range all the way from the Isles of Scilly, just off St Martin's, all the way over to Selsey Bill in Sussex. All of them are managed by different groups, but they're all associated with a local marine organisation who is using the data to promote marine conservation locally, talk about the cetaceans in their area. But on a large scale, Chelonia is archiving all this data with a view to looking at those long-term trends and seeing over a 3 to 5 year period, year on year, are there more dolphins or more porpoises? And obviously, if we can get that differentiation between the species, that would be absolutely wonderful. And a big benefit to doing that, it is linking it with the marine groups as they do organise visual surveys in the same areas. So between the visual surveys organised by the Wildlife Trusts and other organisations, and the boat surveys conducted by the various safari boats that go out all around Cornwall, we are working hard to link the visual surveys with our FPOD data. And a number of universities and other organisations, Natural England being one, who are quite keen to share sites with us and are looking at putting broadband acoustic receivers and even eDNA receivers and recorders on these sites as well. So it was a big ask going to these people and saying, can you take an FPOD and maintain it in a single site for 3 to 5 years? But with a bit of support and lots of collaboration, it is a model that is working well, and we do hope to extend it around the coast using people like Natural England to help us do that. But as a model, it is proving quite successful, and we are very happy with that. Okay, I think are there any questions for Nick or myself?
Just had one question come into the chat from Karen. Don't know if you're reading it now, Joe.
I see Operation Citation. Yeah, we have come across those in Torbay, and I think they do some visual surveys down around Start Point and around that bit of coast. That area is on our list fairly soon. I think we are working with the University of Plymouth, who have some sites around Torbay, and that is in our site. So as soon as we get a pod in the water around there, we will be looking for local groups to really take ownership of that data and use it to promote cetacean conservation in the local community. Yeah, it's Berryhead, that's it, yeah. eDNA, that was some conversations I had just this week. I was approached by somebody. What tends to happen is when you establish these fixed point monitoring sites and you start publicizing them, other people come along and say that's fantastic. There's all sorts of things I'd like to do with that. Can we share it? Can we put our monitoring on there? The most recent, one of the most exciting ones is eDNA, but that's literally a conversation I've had this week. But we hope that will be going somewhere. That will be quite an interesting project if it goes ahead, but it's very early stages.
The specific question there is about how you can interpret the environmental DNA if you've got water currents carrying the DNA. And I think the idea is that the DNA kind of breaks down fairly rapidly in the sea. So maybe after 24 hours, it's a small fraction of what it was. So it doesn't get kind of smeared over the whole sea, as it were. And hopefully that will enable this idea to work. But you then have to know the rate at which DNA degrades in the sea, as well as the currents. So there's a lot of work to do to turn eDNA into a way of determining trends. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more questions you could raise about eDNA, and I'm not an authority on it, but that's just an outline.
Yeah, I think that the conversation I had where there was a sampler that had maybe 5 tubes on it, and one would open for a certain time each day, grab a sample, then it would all be pulled up, and there would be about a 2-week window to get that to a lab. So it would be a fairly short-term sample and then turn it around fairly quickly. But that, as I say, it is very early stages. The most challenging part of data collection, I have to say, we delegate data collection to the marine groups. We give them the FPOD and we support them in that. But it is the collaborations. They need to work with the local fishers, the local community, and anyone out on the water can help with this. And if there are people doing visual surveys and looking out at what's happening, that's even better. I think the most useful collaborations have been with the universities, the port authorities, and the Wildlife Trust. They have a lot of authority. We try to avoid having to go through MMO licensing, and that means if we can go in a port authority area, they have jurisdiction over MMO, and that gives us a big advantage in being flexible on what we can do. And we also work on existing sites, which is why we're very keen to collaborate with universities that have acoustic releases on the seabed and are happy to host an FPOD for us.
Yeah, I mean, in brief, the most challenging bit is getting the instrument down and back again without it getting stolen or lost.
The Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust is Scotland. We haven't looked that far ahead. I know Chelonia has done a lot of work around Scotland with many different groups over the years. Nick, do you know the Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust?
Yes, yeah, and I've done some work out there, but they haven't got any long-term acoustic monitoring going, as far as I know. Yeah, I think it would. This kind of data would add something to their kind of knowledge of their area.
Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Yes, we are at the moment talking to the Dorset Wildlife Trust, and Peter Tinsley there has agreed with RS Aqua to borrow an acoustic release through his connections. So we are getting one at the eastern end of Dorset now. So there is a gap between that eastern end of Dorset and the Selsey Bill pods we have. So it would be nice to have some monitoring in that section. We haven't looked into that in detail yet because the Isle of Wight there and the Solent and the military and all the traffic. We need to look at that in some detail to decide where would be a sensible place to put monitoring in that area. Any pods in Scotland? That's probably one for Nick. There is a lot of activity in Scotland, but yeah, that's Chelonia thing.
Yeah, so the Outer Hebrides, Sarah Dolman of the Whale and Dolphin Conservation Society has been monitoring, I'm trying to remember the name, I think it's Loch Erisaig on Lewis, and there have been, or yeah, I'm trying to think what else is there. Yeah, the Dunstafnage Marine Lab of SAMS, the Scottish Association for Marine Science, they've made substantial use of pods to monitor tidal power sites in Scotland, including in the Hebrides, when they've drifted pods through the Gulf of Corryvreckan with its famous whirlpools. And it's a potential tidal power site. Yeah, and there've been studies actually in the Shetlands and for tidal power, but there isn't anything that kind of quite fits into the model of the CATT's program, of trying to keep a pod in the same place for 5 years. So the other side of Scotland's got the Eco Maths project. Maybe that does come round to the west, I'm not quite sure. Yeah, okay, so there is stuff going on in Scotland. The actual explicit aim of monitoring trends is kind of a key thing here, and I'm not really in a position to speak about that. I mean, not because I'm banned.
Thank you both. If anyone has any other questions, you're welcome to unmute as well to ask that, or you can continue putting them in the chat.
Can I just say one of the key questions for us is distinguishing dolphin species. So what we need to do that actually is acoustic data from a pod moored on the seabed with visual data to tell us what species that was we just heard. So we can then label the data with what species it was. And that's the sort of first step in learning to distinguish them. And this instrument should be very powerful at doing that, because it doesn't have to do it one click at a time. The ability to pull out click trains means you can look at the characteristics of all the clicks in a train, and you can even aggregate them into all the clicks in an encounter, because typically you see it's quiet, and then along comes a dolphin or group of dolphins. You get a lot of data from them, but they've gone again in a period of time that's anywhere from a few minutes upwards. But usually, if it's not a tidal site, it's from a few minutes up to a kind of maximum of about 30. But where you've got animals feeding in a tidal stream off a headland, sometimes they'll be there for like half the tide cycle when the conditions suit their hunting strategy. So you get long encounters. But in any event, getting this labeled data is absolute gold dust for us. How about that last one? The pods do give the time. Yeah, they give it down to microseconds actually, so it can be matched with survey sheets. And in fact, you can take an Excel survey sheet and drop your species from your sightings straight into the pod file. So now when you look at the data, it'll say bottlenose dolphin, which is what you had on your survey sheet. Yeah, the Sea-Watch Foundation, yes, Peter Evans et al. We do work with them, and a lot of monitoring was done with earlier versions of this instrument in Cardigan Bay in Wales. And hopefully they will sort of pick up on this trend monitoring idea as well.
I have a question, actually, which I think will be of interest to the audience, but what is the best way for people watching this webinar to kind of get involved and support this work where they are?
It's really get in touch with us at Chelonia Limited in Mousehole. There's not many of us in Mousehole, I should say, the proper pronunciation. And Joe is particularly interested to hear from anybody who's sort of potentially interested in doing deployments. And he was saying 3 to 5 years, quite correctly, but we hope it will go on a lot longer than that, because like all these population monitoring things, the longer you go on, the more you understand what's actually happening with those species. Yeah, we hope at the end of 5 years, people will be really keen to continue. Oh yeah, the thing about individuals versus organizations. Actually, that's one for you, really, Joe, isn't it?
Yes, we started off working with the marine groups that are affiliated with the Cornwall Wildlife Trust, and then we attracted a lot of other groups. They're mentioning Chelsea there, the dolphin people in Sussex are a very big, well-organized group, and really we will work with anybody if they can meet those criteria. Well, 3 to 5 years is a fairly long time scale, and you need a lot of collaboration to get a pod in the water and service it every 4 months over that period. That is really the challenge. A lot of the marine groups we work with have a lot of students, so they have a high churn rate. People join, be there for a couple of years and go again. But that's happened for a long time, and due to sea search and shore search and other citizen science projects in Cornwall, we're really good at managing that through the Wildlife Trust. So what I'm looking for with these other groups is can they maintain that sort of engagement over a long period? And it's nice to see if they are doing a sort of a visual surveys and they have a long history of it, then that is very encouraging, because we're looking at matching year on year. So having a pod out for 6 months, there's interesting data comes in, but for trend tracking, we really are looking at that long-term fixed point monitoring solution, and that's really when I talk to the groups, that's the sort of information I want from them. The Chelsea Bill ones, this is part of our collaboration with the University of Plymouth. They first went out, I believe, in about April this year. There are 3 pods of Chelsea Bill, and we've already had 1 set of data, so about 4 months worth from 3 pods. That's 1 year's worth of data already come in. I know I spoke to the people. This is Emma Sheehan's project at Plymouth University, and Pete Davis is actually out there with IFCA servicing these sites for us. And I know they are just looking for a weather window to go out and get the second lot of data. So potentially by the end of this season, we will have 2 years worth of data just from those pods at Chelsea Bill. So yeah, we do have data already, and we are getting more from Chelsea.
There's an interesting angle on that Chelsea Bill data, which is that that far east in the channel, you don't get common dolphins very often, but there is now a group of bottlenose dolphins, which you used to think were ours, but they've moved east. So there we're seeing what is probably mostly bottlenose dolphin data, whereas down here we're seeing mostly common dolphin data. And there's 2 sites near Chelsea Bill, and it's a kind of interesting thing to see if we see bottlenose dolphins on both of them at the same time, or only separately. So the group is like moving around as one group. And, you know, you're only going to get it on one of the two instruments because they're a few miles apart, are they, Joe?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So, and so far it fits that description. So it's actually starting to give insight into group structure in bottlenose dolphins. I know there are much more powerful methods, but, you know, it's a little bonus.
Yeah, Karen mentions Operation Citation again. Yeah, you are definitely on our radar. We are aware of you, and as soon as we get some sort of firm plans for locations around Tor Bay, we will definitely be in touch. It is something we know that University of Plymouth are using acoustic releases in that area. So we're in conversation with them, and we haven't actually been offered sites there yet, but generally we have a good collaboration, and if that did work to their advantage, because after all they service it for us, we would go for that, and certainly link up with Operation Citation. Nick, do you know the organization Orca?
Well, I know Orca. As far as we're not working with them. As far as I know, their focus is on surveys from platforms of opportunity, and they've done very good work. So what we need is these local people, whatever that means. I mean, we're all local people, aren't we? Who can sort of commit to this long-term monitoring of a site. That's our only criterion. You know, we'll work with anybody if they can do that. And the resilience point that somebody mentioned earlier is a good one. You know, a very dedicated single individual who maybe dives and can use a particular site would be fine. For the trend monitoring, we like I was saying, we don't have to maintain exactly the same sites all the way through. When we analyze it, we'd look at the follow-on year on year at any single site. We'd refer the data from one year, one site to the same site in subsequent years. But we can do that with new sites as well. Unless the site runs for 2 years, it's not going to have much value. It's just probably worth saying that in the Mexican study of the Vaquita, because of the huge difficulties working with the fisheries there, they actually only monitored a period of 3 or 4 months in each year, the same 3 or 4 months. And we're still kind of thinking maybe that's what we should do with this to make the challenge less. But we need to sort of see quite a bit of data to get an idea of whether that is really going to work. Actually, that last question about sounds, we're sort of supporting a project in Brazil to look at whether acoustic monitoring would be useful in the conservation of the Amazon River dolphin, the Boto. And the very first data we saw from them was absolutely staggering, because those dolphins don't whistle like all the marine dolphins do. And people kind of thought they're missing something, they're a bit thick or something. Anyway, we put pods in there and discovered, well, they don't whistle, but they use incredibly complex, very fast click trains, which are clearly their social communication. So they've moved their channel of social communication from whistling, which is omnidirectional, to clicks, which are highly directional. And I think they're the only animal species I can think of that has got highly directional communication between individuals. So you can talk to one person and not the person, as it were, somewhere off to their side. Yeah, so we're trying to translate their click rates into a sound agreeable to the human ear. And I think we should try and get a Brazilian pop singer to base a song on it to give the dolphins more, you know, make them more loved by the people, because they can suddenly start to relate to this animal. Those dolphins are pretty good at relating to people, actually.
That's fascinating to hear about. So we've got the last few comments coming through to the chat, but yeah, we've a couple of minutes left really before 2, so this is the last chance if anyone has any last questions to fit in, and then we'll wrap up for today. We've just placed a number of links in the Zoom chat, which are to both Chelonia and Research Development UK's social media and LinkedIn pages, if you'd like to keep in touch and follow this work, as well as a link to a YouTube channel where there's various videos of Nick describing the data analysis tools and techniques once the data is gathered and loaded into the software. So yes, I think we can wrap up there for today. I want to say a huge thank you to Nick and Joe for giving up your lunchtime today and providing this really interesting talk.
Yes, pleasure.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And as we say, we're 1 year into a 5+ year project, so we're very interested in feedback, get your ideas and suggestions. So please do contact us.